Is Gen Z the most conservative generation? President Trump's 2024 election victory was propelled by the youth vote. His support among young people jumped 10 points between 2020 and 2024, which represented the highest level of youth support for a Republican presidential candidate since 2008. But is this really about Trump or even about being conservative? One researcher from Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center found it's actually not that simple, and even more concerning, democracy may be in big trouble. Joining me now to talk about her brand new policy brief is Harvard fellow Melina Gazer-Stark, and her brief is titled 2024 Presidential Election, the Broken Bond Between Youth and Democracy. Hi, Melina.
Hi, thank you for having me on today.
I find your research, I was just telling you, fascinating. I find this entire topic very interesting. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of how can it not be that Gen Z is becoming more conservative? How could that be? Doesn't that defy logic?
Yeah, of course. And I think a lot of the understanding when we saw the outcome from this vote, as you said, a massive shift towards Trump and towards the Republicans, that this must be ideological. So I think there were a lot of newspaper headlines saying, is this the most conservative generation of Gen Z that we've ever had? But if you actually look at the data on this generation, they've not actually become more ideologically conservative or shifted to the right. And in fact, they've actually become slightly less conservative than they were in 2016 when they first voted for Trump. So I think what my research has really looked into is there something deeper going on? Is there a bigger picture thing that we're missing when we only look at the ideology? And if you look at the broader relationship that this generation have with democracy and their system of governance, we can actually begin to see that that's really been breaking down over the years. So back when we went to the elections, the time when everyone in America went out to the polls, only 27% of this generation strongly believed that democracy was the best system of governance. And that was markedly lower than the older generations at the time. So what the research that we've done has found is actually the vote for Trump on the whole was rather than a shift towards the right and seeing this as an ideological turn, but this generation saw that they didn't believe that their governance system and the democratic systems that were there to represent their interests were really fulfilling that job for them. And instead they looked at, I think MAGA was able to tap into this discontent and actually tap into it and be like, we can give a voice to this and we can give a change and a recognition and almost an agency in the system that you haven't felt has been functioning for you so far.
Okay, so there is a lot in there. I want to break it down because this is crucially important, not just for, I think, the American political system to pay attention to, but also voters as we sort of move through 2026 and 2028. So I want to first start with this hypothesis that you now have, which is it's not along Gen Z is not shifting along ideology, political party structure. They're shifting based on what you're describing as disillusionment with the government. Their idea that the democracy that they were sold isn't working for them. So they are now shifting to find somebody that can bring them the change, what you describe in your paper as radical change, the radical change they want, but also give them a voice into what happens with them. So my question is why is this Gen Z so disillusioned with democracy?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think to what the research demonstrates and to get into as an entry point is thinking about what actually has been this generation's experience with the democratic system, because that shapes the way that you view it and the way that you understand it. And if you take, for example, going back, I think COVID was a key point for this generation where they were at a very pivotal point in their life, whether that's in terms of education, social development, work development. This was a point in their life where it wasn't just key for them, but it was often for this generation the first time that they actually came in contact with a democratic system and the democratic governance system having an impact on their life. And for many of them, rather than that being a kind of enabling and supportive role, it often was much more of a kind of impeding and preventative role. And actually, if you look at the data, Gen Z is the generation that has been seen to suffer the most from COVID, and also is the only generation that still sees it as having a long-lasting impact on them to the present. And if you then combine that with other kind of the economic system that the generation's entering into, they're actually the generation that since the World War is the first generation to likely not do as well as the generation prior to them.
Mhm.
So when you compound this, and you can take other examples as well, it gives the direct life experience of your first entry into democratic governance and your first experience of democracy not actually functioning to serve your interests and not actually functioning to support you. So
That's
that
interesting. I see what you're saying.
yeah.
So that's the key point. The key point there, according to your research, is that they have just felt sort of left behind in the system. So they're looking almost to, I mean, savior is probably a strong word, but they're looking to somebody that can speak to,
Yeah.
and they're less interested in if that speaker is from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party.
Exactly.
Does
Completely
that
right.
does okay? So you mentioned it at the beginning that now President Trump during the 2024 campaign and his sort of MAGA movement really did an excellent job. And you talk about it in your research. They did an excellent job of tapping in to that disillusionment. But I don't know how closely you've been following politics in the US since this paper came out. But of course, in New York, we're also seeing Zohar Mamdani, who is self-described democratic socialist, which is almost a swing in the completely opposite direction as what the MAGA movement is. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, is this just proving your point that this younger generation doesn't really give a crap about if you have a D or an R next to your name? They care about what they see as radical change.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about the ideology is confusing it, and I think it's about a sense of being in a system or experiencing a system where you don't feel responded or listened to. And a party, or it doesn't matter what the party is, but an actor that's able to actually build a relationship and build a sense that you're being responded to and listened to, I think will be successful. And I think looking even at the broader global picture, I think that exactly proves the point that it's not along ideological lines. But if we look globally, where there's similar trends in Europe about democratic dissatisfaction amongst, for example, France, the UK, and Spain, but the UK, the European picture where we have a multi-party system. So not only do you just have the Republicans or Democrats, but you have a wide range of parties. You can actually put this to the test a lot better. So for example, in the UK, that where there's increasing democratic dissatisfaction amongst this generation, similar to America, young voters are not just voting or showing indication to vote for Reform, which is a more right-wing party, but also there's, for example, Jeremy Corbyn's new party that's just been launched, or for the Green Party, and a similar trend in Germany, where there was increased support amongst young people for the AfD, which is right-wing, but also for the Left Party. And I think this is exactly the point that you were bringing up, is it's about which and actors are able to really listen to and build a relationship with these young people and respond to them in a way that they feel like the system hasn't responded to them so far.
I think there is a question because I think there's a lot of millennials and a lot of Gen Xers who feel just as disillusioned with the United States political governance system as the Gen Zers do. But why have you looked into why it is that they're not trending away from democracy as much as Gen Z?
So we are seeing increased rates of trending away from democracy or democratic dissatisfaction, just not as high at all compared to Gen Z. And I think this is
So
definitely
what
something
is it?
yeah, so I think it still goes back, and the research shows goes back to that point of what is your experience of democracy, not as political actors or parties, but your overall experience. And as Gen Z, I think, are younger, and you take their experience as being a much narrower time frame where it hasn't served a function for them. The older generations have a much broader picture where democracy has been functioning better, it has been responding to them. So your perspective that you're coming into viewing democracy is from a very different viewpoint and a very different, almost historical or personal understanding. I think that's the key division point.
So I am wondering what happens if what they voted for, this younger generation, this Gen Z generation, what if this radical change they voted for in America specifically and sort of propelled, gave their support to now President Trump. What if he doesn't deliver on that radical change? Have you done much research on disillusionment with their choice, if there's any?
So I think that's, again, that's not something I've done as much research in, but I think the key point, and I think what the kind of concluding points of the research of what are the next steps shows that this engagement with young people can't just be superficial to kind of win over their votes, but actually has to be sustained and prove to young people that actually we do deliver on what we're doing and we're building an actual relationship of trust and respect there. And I think if MAGA or Trump isn't able to deliver on that, then we might see them looking for other alternatives. And I think it creates a space, even if MAGA do deliver, for other actors or other political actors or organizations to come in and try and see how they can better listen and respond to the needs of Gen Z, almost like it would be at any election with any age group. I just think this is a generation that needs more attention that they haven't previously had.
Yeah. How does social media play into all this?
Yeah. So I think social media, as you must know, inevitably plays a massive role. I think now 4 in 5 young people get their political information from online sources or from social media. So the climate is completely changing. But I think what's really important, and because both campaigns, I think, had a very prevalent social media status. So it's not as though the Paris campaign didn't use social media.
Right.
But I think in a way it shows that point of social media is based around building a relationship and building that relationship of trust with the person that you're engaging with on the other side. And so I think simply just being on social media for a political party isn't enough to kind of get through to young people. And it demonstrates that broader point of actually these parties and these actors needing to build actual relationships with young people, where social media is a tool that you can actually learn what young people want and actually engage and listen to them rather than just a way to get through to them. And so I think it's about how they use social media to develop a relationship rather than just being on it itself.
Right. And anybody that is on social media understands that concept. It's not just about you physically being there and your videos or your content appearing. It's about what you're doing with that content. I want to talk about your research on sort of global democracy trends. It's something I touched on at the beginning of this. And, you know, as a person who has lived in the United States my entire life, right, we've got this drumbeat in our heads of, you know, having a democracy, a constitutional republic, right? We have this sort of drumbeat of this being the best form of government. But you have some statistics that are, to me, quite alarming in your work. 16% of people under the age of 30 believe democracy is working for young people. 16%. And then this is perhaps most alarming. Before 2024, only 27% of Gen Z strongly believe democracy is the best form of government. And what does that mean? Does that mean that this younger generation prefers authoritarian governments? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, it's very alarming data. And I think in one level, I think what it actually represents is that the democracy, as we've been talking about, the democratic system hasn't been functioning sufficiently for these young people. And when we talk about why is democracy great, we can't just assume that just by saying that, people actually believe it. They actually have to be demonstrated it through their experience with the democratic system, that it does function and it does improve people's lives. And it is ultimately, out of all the options, the best system to have. And I think at the same time, while it's alarming, I think we should also take it as a moment to be like, this is a moment to actually reimagine how our democratic system can function. And it's a warning call that if we don't tap into these young people and actually engage with them, this could increase. But at the same time, it's a time that we can step back and think, how can we actually reimagine some of our democratic structures and our ways of governing? So I think it's a really great opportunity to potentially look at what's happening in other countries or look at what other countries are doing as ways to actually bring these young people back inside and use it as an opportunity to strengthen our democracies and use this as a warning call if this is a symptom of something going wrong, but we can fix it and make it better.
We don't want to have the system that we have built in this country for almost 250 years. We don't want to see it crumble because the people who are in charge of sort of protecting and operating it are failing at delivering on the basic goals of democracy, right? So I wonder, I know, and you talked about it in your paper a little bit, there are 3 separate solutions sort of to restore young people's belief in a democratic system. Tell me about that.
Of course. So I broke it down in the research into three different levels. So there was the kind of individual community level, which is recognizing that democracy doesn't just live at the time that we go to the ballot and leave the ballot, but democracy continues to function in the spaces between. And it's about making sure that young people feel part of a community and democracy is almost brought to them. So there's this great concept of a civic home or a political home, which is
Right.
where you're building spaces of communities where young people naturally come together. So at a
Right.
concert, a sports ground, and you have
And
these discussions.
and I think you pointed specifically to Trump's MAGA coalition as something that really did that well.
Yeah, so I think if you even look at Turning Point USA, which was over 3,500 campuses and schools across
Right.
America, it was about not just kind of coming at the time of the election and asking for a vote, but in the time between that, really going and engaging and building up a kind of ground space and momentum to give young people an opportunity to voice their opinions and for them to listen back. I think the concept of a civic home takes from that, but can be or should be potentially non-partisan. So it's just spaces for young people to come together and discuss. But the
Right.
MAGA movement, I think, did that well on tapping into the key point of it being sustained and not feeling like a transaction.
Right.
So that's one way. I think a second level is the governmental way. So it's looking at how can we almost restructure or bring in new elements to our governance structures that shifts the power dynamic slightly. So young people are brought in and demonstrated from a very early point that they have a say and they have a remit. So a really interesting example is in Finland. They have these compulsory youth councils where young people from a young age come in and get decisions over their kind of the allotment of money for areas that really impact our lives. So that's whether that's like health, education, socializing, sport. And it shows from a very young age that young people both have a place in democracy, but also that democracy impacts their lives and they can shape democracy as well. And we can look at that as inspiration of how can we bring that over to America or the UK or other countries to really actually bring young people properly into the fold of democracy and ensure that they're listened to. And then finally, I also talk about in the research the kind of partisan levels. How can parties not restructure themselves, but how can they reinvigorate themselves so they properly account for young people? So that could be using digital tools, such as a party in Spain created this digital infrastructure, which is a really great way of, again, meeting young people where they are, but actually using the new technologies that are emerging to really find out what young people want and shape their policies around it.
And I think some people might be watching and saying, oh, young people, they don't know what they're talking about. We don't need to pay it. And I think generally the two-party system in the United States has really taken that approach to young people, sort of dismiss them as, well, they don't vote anyway, so I don't need to, worry about them. I'm more interested in the older generation who is a constant voter, like they show up. But the reality is eventually young people become the majority, right? Like they grow up and they become the majority here. So I wonder what is in your research and in your view, what does the future look like if democracies like the one here in the United States does not start to shift to do what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think if that does happen, then I think we'll just see this continuing trend on the assumption that, for example, the parties that Gen Z do elect don't deliver on their promises. I
Right.
think you'll just see this growing kind of disconnect from democracy as a system. And that I think can be very troubling and it can lead, the way that it doesn't even just impact who's elected into power, but it shapes the way that you view society and your position within that. So I think it's quite a worrying trend, and I think the recent election result, especially even for the Democrat Party, was, as you were saying, a kind of trembling or a wake up from that assumption that's been carried that
Right.
even not in the long term, this is going to start shaping results, and it's going to start showing. It was a call from the young people being like, we do have power and we do have a say, and we should be listened to within our governance system.
And clearly, what I will say, because I know my young audience very well, is this group of young people, and I've been doing this for a very long time, but this particular group, Gen Z, is extraordinarily active. This group knows how to mobilize, they know how to get together, they know how to do things. So there is a real concern and danger of not listening and sort of ignoring what your research is showing.
And I think even flipping it, looking at the side of this is, as you're saying, a generation that's extremely, I think, very strong. And it's actually being like, how can we use this as an advantage in a democracy? Let's bring them into the fold because they have so many creative ideas, entrepreneurial, coming up with great, like projects,
Yeah.
let's actually, rather than having them fraying away from society, let's bring them in so they can actually be properly seen as active participants
Yeah.
and strengthen the democratic societies that we have.
That's a great point. There is also the positive side of that. And I think this generation could really do some
Yeah,
amazing things.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
Melina, this is fascinating work. I want to thank you so much for your time. And of course, for everyone who is watching right now, I will email out Melina's policy paper to you in my next Facts HQ email. So make sure you sign yourself up for that. Melina, thank you so much for your time. And please keep me posted on your next work.
You will do. Thank you so much for having me.